So I will recommend, and one of the things I think we should do is return to with a caveat. I think there is a great need for us to return to our local provisions as a choice of food to consume, however, not in the amounts they were consumed. I often say that when we look at the way we eat post slavery, our diets, in a way, our food system was designed by people whose intention was not good for us. And the intention was to have slaves work on the plantation. And so they got the ends of the meat, the pigtails, and in those days, the chicken feet. And that's why, as a culture, we've grown to love those foods. But however, those foods are the foods that are something high in saturated fats and they're not healthy for us. The challenge, the issue is that we sometimes compare it to our grandparents' lives and don't realize that our grandparents' world was as toxic as it is today. So many chemicals from vehicles and factories and different things, and the life may not have been as stressful as it was, but also we were very physically active. I don't think we can compare our lifetime to theirs and wait on the scale and find an equivalent. So it was vastly different. I think though that because our lifestyle has changed, we have to be able to make some shifts and ask ourselves the question: how are those dietary habits serving us? Because by and large, I think if our grandparents came back today, with the exception of seeing more rice and pasta, they would recognize the wheat. I believe that. The issue is that we are not eating as much provisions or we're not planting as much provisions as we used to. The reality is also that the population has gotten larger. So whereas our small scale farming was able to provide and meet the needs of a lot of the persons back then, the evidence has been consistent. The population is growing. So even though my grandparents and them may have had 7 and 10 children, they all worked on the farm, but they were able to take care of themselves. But now the food system is challenged with feeding an ever growing population in the midst of things like climate change, which sees a rise in temperatures, which also seeing excessive rainfalls and rising sea levels. All of these are seen to be affecting the quality of our food. In a need to meet the demand, farmers are now not doing good farming practices, and we are seeing that even that seems to be affecting the nutrients in our food. Yeah. So I mean, I we should return to the types of foods, but the quantity we have to put a check on it.
So, Mr. Williams, when we're talking about making sure that we have sufficient food for who's living in Grenada, and then also leaning on the concept of food security to help reduce chronic non-communicable diseases and food availability, what else can be done to reduce the risk of chronic non-communicable diseases and even still in food availability or maybe the way we traditionally prepare foods? Any other aspect to that you want to add before we move on?
I think it's important to consider that one of the areas where we fall behind, I think, is with adequate data collection. I think what is not measured doesn't get done, and what we cannot treat that which we know not of. So if we do not know a problem exists, we cannot effectively treat it. I think I believe when we look at our data, we are not able to show the amount of food produced within a given year and to compare it to what is imported. I think data collection is important because even when we talk about nutrition, the FAO says that when we look across the world, that we have enough food to feed the population. Now that is okay when it comes to calories. So if you talk about the amount of calories that a person need, if you would take that one person, the average calorie that they need, and you multiply it by the total amount of people in a given population or across the world, if the amount of people equals the amount of calories that they need, then you can see that we have enough. But of course, when we're talking about food security, calories is just part of the picture. Micronutrients also play a part. And even though we have enough food, is the food equally distributed and shared? And so in other parts of the world, we talk about things like food desert and having access to the food physically near them. I think data collection, especially for small and developing states like ours that are prone to the impacts of climate change. I think if we want to be able to track our progress and to see and realize real progress, we have to have data to show. There's a strong need for us to put priorities into either building the system or creating an enabling environment. We have to either bring in more persons into data collection, data analytics, and so to process the data that we need on a national level.
So we have people who are following our advice. We put out articles that could be helpful for specific chronic non-communicable diseases and communicable diseases as well, like the
Yeah,
cold. We were able to release that, the post-carnival flu,
yeah,
that kind of information. And so we're getting into people wanting to make healthier food choices, but then it's limiting. It's
yes,
limiting for them. It's limiting to them for availability, and it's limiting to them for cost,
which is access.
which is access. And then so access now becomes broader
Yes,
because based on what you're saying, there is a gap and that needs to be addressed in terms of statistics. There's a
yeah,
lack of research to talk about import versus what actually is grown. Because right now there seems to be a good working relationship with some farmers with major grocery stores or small stores across the island, and they were like, this is what I have, do you want to purchase it? And then there's that exchange. But even in those transactions, which someone may seem as insignificant, it is important data
correct. Very
for
important.
it. So when we talk about that, then if based on what the information we do have, Grenada doesn't have enough, well then what is the suggestion about partnerships with the region?
It's very important. And similarly to as is done, I think there was some work being done to in the health aspect to have some islands, and there was some work done to have some islands even be centers of excellence in health. This is not new, unfortunately. I happened on a book that is very old in the 1970s, I think it was, and there was some move by CARICOM as well to have this concerted effort, so so that some countries would emphasize on some products. Given, for example, we know that Guyana, as a country in CARICOM, has a lot of land space. So it means that they can do better at producing rice. And then the rice, from a regional perspective, can somehow be considered local. And vice versa. So that if we understand, for us to achieve food security, the best approach, we have to work together as a region, where we know that some countries have expertise and then they can produce and supply certain things. We utilize that and we create the enabling environment, whether it's through policy, through trade agreements, partnership and agreements within CARICOM, because we already have free movement of goods and services and labor and stuff. And I think those are some of the framework that we can use to push food security. Instead, if we have every country trying to do it for themselves, we will not succeed. Because in reality, when we look at the amount of food it takes to feed a population and the amount of staff, or the amount of not just staff but the amount of external supplies and things that we need to get it going, it will be challenging. It will be challenging. And for us to be successful, there must be a regional approach. There were many attempts at a regional approach, but of course, the politics sometimes often gets in the way ahead of the advancement that we can be making together. I mean, I think the US is a good example. If you look at the US, it's similar in nature. And you have the United States, but everything that is consumed in one particular state is not necessarily grown in that state, and so they have this agreement and this relationship that allows for some things, wines to come all the way from California, grapes all the way from California, avocados all the way from California, sometimes all the way to New York, which is on the other end. And because California as compared to New York might be have a better climate for growing that and for growing grapes and stuff. In New York, there might be grape, there might be apples growing there, and there's some parts. It just depends, because even within a country, we have different what is called agroecological zones where some plants grow better There is even something that talks about when it comes to food security, precision agriculture, which means that instead of us wasting a lot of resources and just blanket putting fertilizers and using water, there are some areas that may not need as much watering, may not need as much fertilizer. We see we have good soil, but how are we testing it? And how are we seeing how are we, where's the data to show us that whether we are in St. Vincent or Grenada and you have a volcanic island, how is that same soil comparing to another island or another part of the island? What grows best here? And I think that data isn't available, and it can be quite helpful, especially in addressing food security, because the end all of food security, and again, the challenge is we have a population to feed. That regardless, from the day we come into the earth, there are two things that we will always do. We may not always walk, we may not always talk, we may not always do things we enjoy. We will always eat, and everybody must die. Those are two things that will never change. And so it means that we have to build a system again that supports the food security, which in turn leads to persons supporting the overall nutritional health and well-being, further supporting improvement in chronic non-communicable diseases.